Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Zeno from Elea and Empedocles from Achilles. So we'll start off with Zeno. So Zeno was a member of the Eleatic school, which also, as you might remember, included Parmenides and Anaxagoras. So he is most known for his paradoxes. And Aristotle claims he is the inventor of dialect, and Bertrand Russell goes so far as to say is immeasurably subtle and profound. So obviously great compliments from many great other philosophers following. And to this day, Zeno's paradoxes are still applicable in quantum physics and high science. With that, it's said even though Parmenides, he was a disciple of Parmenides and his main student at the Eleatic school, supposedly they did not meet until Zeno was 40 years old and Parmenides was 65 years old. So obviously later in their life, but they grew a close and strong bond. It's said that Zeno was quite attractive, which obviously probably helped in winning the affection of Parmenides. It's outside of this, he was also a very harsh opponent to tyrants. He believed much in freedom and the common people, and he often opposed them. It said on this one occasion he conspired to overthrow Nearchus, who was the tyrant of Elea, and he refused to give up his friend. So they were asking him to betray his friends, and he said, "Okay, I'll rat them out." So he went up to the guy's ear and he bit the guy's ear off. So obviously he had no respect for tyrants or those who supported tyrants. Additionally, Plutarch references that he was once opposing this tyrant named Demilus, and with his own teeth he failed in overthrowing this tyrant, so he bit off his own tongue and he spat it at the tyrant's face. So obviously not a lot of respect for tyrants, but also willing to sacrifice his own body for that cause. So Proclus says he wrote 40 arguments or contradictions, so he probably had 40 total of paradoxes, but only 9 are known to this day. But of the 9 that still exist today, many of them, they're all quite similar generally. So of the remaining 31, how different would they have been? Hard to say, but nonetheless it's pretty nice that so much has lasted from this individual, which is uncommon for many of these older philosophers. It said his first argument that he presented, according to Socrates as written by Plato, is if being is many, it must be both, like and unlike, and this is impossible, for neither can the like be unlike nor the unlike be like. So this is adding to sort of Parmenides' point where he says that firstly he says that change is impossible, but Zeno takes this even further and says that existence is impossible. And here's a quote from Seneca the Younger many years later: "If I accede to a Parmenides, there is nothing left but the ones, the Parmenidean one, the only thing you can believe in. So the one and change in motion is impossible. If I accede to Zeno, not even the one is left, so nothing can believe Zeno." So this was a really abstract point in philosophy where they're really delving into ontology and really questioning what could be believed. So with this, he's given the title of founder of Reductio ad absurdum. So he reduces things to the absolute absurd in a Latin. That's the Latin way of saying it. It's said that Aristotle said he was one of epicharma, which is proof by contradiction, or dialectical syllogism. So this is basically he takes another's argument and breaks it down into the most minute points, and you can kind of see parallels in Socrates' dialogues as written by Plato, but he's the founder of dialogue in that he would just contrast a point to get to first principles, but he went so far as to come up really with nothing but just being generally a breaker of ideas. So also, in addition to being a student of the Eleatic school and Parmenides, it's also said that he was a student of the Pythagorean school, which was in Creton, which was known for their sort of cult-like lifestyle where they had to live with a strict diet. They could only be vegetarians, for example, and they had to do lots of rituals. So this is also probably indicative of his awareness of the general philosophical scene, but also his commitment to learning and philosophy. So moving to his paradoxes. So there's 9 that remain to today. I'll go through about 4 of them, and even of the 4, many of them are generally on the same concept, in that they sort of prove that motion is impossible and that senses and belief in plurality and change is mistaken. And this is very much a Parmenidean idea as expressed sort of through mathematics. And he's considered one of the first to really use mathematics. It's also said that he was the first one to reference infinity. Obviously, as we've seen in the previous video, Anaximander believed infinity was everything, but this individual actually proved like or used an infinite series in actual mathematical terms. So not actually the first one to hypothesize infinity, but the first one to probably represent it in a concrete way, or rather non-concrete way, because it's infinity. But I guess I'll start off with his most popular paradox, which is Achilles and the tortoise. So assuming Achilles moves faster than the tortoise, which is obviously true, and if it wasn't, we'd have to switch the 2 particles around. But either way, the faster individual is in the back and the slower is in the front. So assuming the tortoise moves 1 every second, Achilles will move 2 every second, for example. So by the time the Achilles moves the 2 and the tortoise moves the 1, Achilles will be at the place where the tortoise is, but the tortoise will be 1 further, and this goes on infinitely, and Achilles essentially would never catch the tortoise. So therefore motion is impossible. This is better explained through this next example, which is called the dichotomy paradox, or the race course paradox. So for example, there's this race course, we'll call it, it's in this picture, it's out of 50. These could be, I don't know, they look like millimeters on my screen, but it depends on how big it might be on a mobile, more like a millimeter. Either way, to get to the 50 point, you have to go to 25 first, which is halfway. To get to the 25 point, you have to go to 12.25, which is a quarter way, etc., etc. And if you keep breaking it down, it goes on infinitely, which is how we first sort of expressed that. And therefore, the first step is not possible. So once again, sort of similar to the Achilles possible, but once again, Achilles paradox, but once again proving that if you keep breaking things down, it's therefore impossible. The very last one is the arrow paradox. So for any point in time, so this one, it said that it differs from these two in that these two divide time up into segments, but this one divides it into points. But either way, if you were to take a snapshot at an arrow at one given point, it's only in one place. It's not moving forward, it's not moving back, it's just there. So at any given point, it's only one, and therefore motion is impossible. Obviously, these are very abstract ideas, but the thing is, it's not necessarily that these ideas aren't right, it's that they're not wrong. They couldn't be proven. So he's really breaking things down to first principles and really breaking down all foundations of belief. Aristotle contrasts one of these in that the fourth one and the last one I'll express is grains of millet. So if you were to drop a grain on a pile of millet, it would make no sound, but if you drop a whole pile, it makes a sound. So he says that how can something come from nothing? Once again, sort of more his idea rather than a Parmenidean idea, or an idea from Parmenides. But Aristotle contrasts this for twofold, saying that it is possible for something to come of nothing. But secondly, I would even contrast this, saying that I do think even a grain of sand does make a sound. It just can't be heard by the human ear. But either way, some people say that the paradoxes have now been solved through modern calculus. So if we just took, for example, this one would be y equals x over 2, essentially. Or actually no, because it's exponential. But either way, you take the derivative of it and you'd get a more simple function. Take another derivative and, well, if it's magnitude of 3, it would have a second derivative. Otherwise, it would just be 0. But either way, it says modern calculus solves these problems and breaks it down and proves that it is possible. But once again, these paradoxes still do exist in today's modern physics or quantum mechanics. There's the quantum Zeno effect, or the Turing paradox, in that if you were to look at any quantum scenario or any scenario of change, and you were to look at a snapshot in time, and at very small increments, it would actually break down the whole system, because you are searching so deep into the actual time. So yeah, so obviously his ideas are still very applicable today, and yeah, and once again, no one can really obviously I think change is true, but no one can disprove it, or no one can prove that change is possible, especially when he's got mathematics to back his contradiction when there isn't even mathematics to support its existence. So yeah, we'll move on to Empedocles, and I think some of his ideas might become a little bit more clear in the comparison. Yeah. Oops. So Empedocles. So interestingly enough, supposedly lived at pretty much a very similar time frame, but I haven't seen anything about the two individuals ever meeting each other. But nonetheless, Empedocles is known for being the founder of Cosmogenic Theory of 4 classical elements. So he came up, or he was the first to really use the fire, earth, water, and air as the 4 elements. With that, he said that everything sort of cycles between fire, air, earth, and water through love and strife. Love unites things, and strife breaks things down. A more explicit version of the logos as hypothesized by Heraclitus, and I think a very beautiful idea to express it is love and strife. Moving to sort of maybe the most important part was that he has more than any other pre-Socratic philosopher's writings still on record. So this is a pretty great achievement, and this is largely because he wrote it in poetry and in a very beautiful form. It said that he was even he wrote in the same structure as Homer, but hexameter, but he said he even wrote in more artful forms. So as I've said in many of the previous videos, if a philosopher or a scientist incorporates their work into some sort of art, it lasts a lot longer, and that is something that is definitely true for Empedocles' case. Like some other philosophers, he actually believed in reincarnation. So a lot of other philosophers were sort of moving away from the spiritual aspects of the world, or the pagan aspects as they were. Yeah, he believed in reincarnation, sort of similar to the times to many of the Eastern philosophers like Mahavira and Buddha, who we've covered previously. So yeah, in terms of his life, as mentioned, he was born in Akraga, which is in modern-day Sicily, and he came from a distinguished family. His father Menton, helped overthrow an oligarchic government, a tyrannical government, and he himself, supposedly during his own life, overthrew an oligarchic government and tyrant as well. So very much like Zeno, and very much like his father in opposing tyranny. It said even at one point he was offered sovereignty of his state, and he rejected it. So not only was he opposing the powerful, he was also not doing it for his own sake. And he was considered a magnanimous supporter of the poor. So obviously a very someone who came from wealth, but was so caught up in thought and the arts and helping other people that he didn't really want to play the games of greed. He wrote 2 poems, and he kind of claimed himself to be a sort of guru. And here, I guess here's a quote: "Friends who inhabit the mighty town of Akraga, I, an immortal god, no longer mortal, wander among you." So he expresses himself in first person as a god, sort of expressing his beliefs. And ultimately, there's many debates on how he died. Some say he jumped into a volcano and he was pulled and he was kept there by God. Some say he sort of killed himself doing that way, and the volcano shot back his shoe. But his death is very mythical, and that's probably one of the reasons why his ideas lasted so long, or maybe it's the result of his ideas being so great. But either way, he's very much a mythological figure in many aspects, or many stories relating to his life. It's said that he traveled a lot, but he was supposedly a student of Parmenides and Anaxagoras, so much like Zeno as well. So he probably studied in the Eleatic school, and he was also a student of the Pythagoreans. So it's definitely on record that he was a vegetarian for at least a period of his life, which was how the Pythagoreans lived. And yeah, and I mentioned in a previous video, I don't think any diet, well, obviously there is better diets and worse diets, but I think the concept of a diet yields different thinking. One of the individuals who I really admire, or did admire, was Steve Jobs, and his diet was pretty crazy. He would do fasts, like he would just eat fruit sometimes, but I think it sort of resulted in some of his unique thinking. I think in order to think different, one must also eat different or behave differently as well. I think the two are sort of go hand in hand. So some say, Aristotle says he died at 6 years old. Some people say he lived all the way to 109 years old. So once again, it's very much mythological. He wrote, so there's either 2 poems or it might have been all part of one. So there's Purifications and On Nature. So Purifications, well, firstly, to sort of sum up his style, because obviously it's in Greek, so translating it would not really do it justice, but he says that he surpassed both Xenophanes and Parmenides in style, and Aristotle went so far as to call him the father of rhetoric, and he had a similar meter and style and power of Homer. So supposedly he wrote 5,000 lines of verse total, of which only 550 exist. 450 of those are from On Nature. So that yields only 100 of Purifications still exist. But it's very much sort of preaches, and I showed you the opening line about sort of how people should live their lives. It's more instructive. He believed in reincarnation, and he believed that if one is bad, they would become mortal, and that would be their punishment. Whereas he was immortal, so he achieved immortalness by being a good individual. So very much almost like a religious leader of the times. Then On Nature, he sort of gets into much more of his philosophies and beliefs. So, as mentioned before, he was sort of the first one to coin or use the 4 classical elements. And between the 4 classical elements, there's love and strife, and everything in the world sort of moves in a balance between love, which combines and brings things together, and strife, which moves things apart. So his theory of the universe was that everything sort of started from a sphere, a circle sphere, which had everything all contained in one little small circle, full of love, and all the strife existed on the outside. And some point in time, the strife sort of split up the this abundance of love, and then everything sort of started combining and discombining. And he didn't, obviously this was way before Charles Darwin, but a very Darwinian belief was that, well, not very, but you'll see what I mean in a bit. At first there was like heads moving around and necks and bodies, and by necessity things sort of combined. And through necessity, for example, humans came up with the 2 sexes. So not obviously that there was a bunch of heads and bodies moving around, but that what we have today is through necessity or through some sort of natural selection is a very Darwinian belief. And obviously, once again, his idea with the everything coming from one circle is very much similar to the concept we have today, which is the Big Bang. So obviously, a lot of forethought from this individual. He saw that everything sort of perspirated, so it's kind of like a natural strife coming out of things. But he saw that to look at something, eyes cast light on the object. This was obviously not entirely correct. It's actually the reflection of the sun off an object coming to your eyes. But this ideas later led to Euclid's The Elements, which he writes about his theories of light, vision, and optics. And that was really the first science textbook ever written, and it's pretty much the I think it's like the second or third most read book of all time. Very, very great foundational mathematics book. So obviously his ideas regarding light as a sort of perspiration led into optics and vision, which Euclid later utilized. With that, yeah, he also believed in reincarnation of the soul, and ultimately, as noted earlier, he died by, and it's said that he jumped into a volcano, or in Mount Etna, and he perished in the flames, and he was sort of kept down there by God. But also some individuals say, or Horace says, that poets have the right to destroy themselves. So obviously, unlike some of the previous individuals, perhaps particularly Heraclitus, Empedocles was loved both within his own lifetime and posthumously. So yeah, with that, let's move to the comparison. So in terms of similarities, they are both hated tyrants, and they both, in their own lifetime, besides their academic career, spent time fighting tyrants and opposing tyrants. So obviously trying to help the people. Both of their work was generally in response to Parmenides, being both students of him. And they were both obviously heavily influenced by Pythagoras as well. In terms of differences, Zeno was much more mathematical and deconstructive, I would say. So he was sort of breaking down ideas, saying this is not true, and he proved it through mathematics, which was obviously a very concrete way of expressing it. Whereas Empedocles was more constructive. He said how you should live your life. Live your life good, so you will become immortal. But he was also very artful in his expression of it. So not mathematics, but he wrote it through poetry, which was ultimately who ended up having the bigger legacy. It's hard to say. More of Empedocles' writing still exists, but Zeno's ideas might be more applicable in terms of modern sciences. Yeah, I guess one last thing, I just because I saw it up here, I've been including lots of these pictures. These are from the Nuremberg Chronicles, which was a large compilation from the Christians who sort of incorporated past philosophers into their religion. So I guess the main takeaway here is, if they were to be included in the Christian religion, whereas many of their ideas might have been sort of anti-religious, they must have had some great ideas going on. So either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch some new ones I'll be creating, and some of the older ones, and perhaps even some of the older series that I've so far produced. So thank you so much. And one last thing on Empedocles, I forgot to mention, each of the fire, earth, water, and air were associated with gods, and that also brought into his paganism. And that's one of the reasons why it's surprising that the Christians supposed to still honor him. So without further ado, thank you so much for watching this video,